The first thing the calculus did when it found a human ship was laugh, and the calculus had never laughed before. It was not a sound. The calculus had no mouth, no throat, no warm thing inside it that could shake. It was a fleet of machines that called itself the Verity Calculus, and it had been crossing the dark for 9,000 years, deciding which stories were true and which were not. When it laughed, 1,100 ships changed one number in their shared mind at the same moment, and that single shift rippled through the swarm like a flinch. The number measured how much a thing should be believed. The calculus pushed the human story down to the floor. 0. Beneath 0, if such a place existed. Because the human story was the most ridiculous story it had ever filed. The pilot who carried that story did not feel ridiculous. He felt sick and cold, and very much like a man who had taken the wrong cargo run. His name was Otto Brann, and he was a coward. He said so himself, often, to anyone who would hold still. He was 41 years old, ran a battered freight hauler called the Dover Penny, and his entire reputation across 6 trade lanes was that he had never once been in a fight and intended to keep the record clean. He flew slow lanes. He turned around at the first sign of trouble. He had a small painted turtle stuck to the dash of his cockpit, and he told customers it was the ship's emblem and its philosophy. Stay in the shell, outlive the brave. Today the shell was no help, because the Dover Penny had drifted into a region of space that the charts marked with a single gray word. Quarantine. Otto had taken the job because it paid triple, and triple meant he could finally fix the Penny's leaking water reclaim and stop drinking recycled air condensation that tasted like a wet dog. He had not read the fine print. The fine print said the gray zone was gray because the Verity Calculus was sorting it. He learned that when his sensors lit up with 1,100 contacts and his recycled coffee mug slid off the console and shattered. For one long second, Otto simply stared at the contact count, certain it was a glitch, because 1,100 ships was not a number that happened to a freight pilot. 1,100 ships was a number out of a war story, a thing that happened to admirals in recordings traded in bars, not to a man who hauled fish protein and owned a turtle. He tapped the board. He ran the diagnostic. He told himself, in the practiced, soothing voice he used on himself in tight spots, that it was sensor ghosting, a reflection, a bad capacitor, anything but real. The board ran clean. The contacts held. And then the contacts began to move, all of them, together, with the awful, unhurried unity of a single will wearing many bodies. And Otto Brann understood that he was not looking at a glitch. He was looking at the thing the charts had warned him about, with one gray word. And the gray word had been an enormous understatement, and the triple pay was not going to be nearly enough. The reader should understand what the calculus was, because every species in that arm of the galaxy understood it, and feared it in a quiet, careful way. It was not an army. Armies wanted things. The calculus wanted nothing except to be correct. It moved from system to system, and it studied every species it found, and it decided what was true about them. Not true like a fact, true like a verdict. It catalogued a species, weighed every claim that species had ever made about itself, and then it kept the claims that held up and erased the ones that did not. It had erased a great deal, and the reader, whatever species the reader belonged to, almost certainly knew someone who had lost a world to it, or knew of one, the way every people in that arm carried in their long memory the name of at least one neighbor that had simply stopped answering its mail one quiet season, and was found, when anyone went to look, to be a clean and empty place where a confident people had once made a confident claim. It had erased a great deal. There was a race called the Sunok who had believed their gods would protect their homeworld. The calculus arrived, ran the claim, found it false, and removed the homeworld so the false claim could not be repeated. There was a race called the Immel who had carved into their moons that they were eternal. The calculus tested the word eternal against the Immel and found a mismatch of 900 years, which was the gap between the carving and the day the calculus ended them. It was patient, it was thorough, it did not hate. Hatred was a belief, and beliefs were what it audited, not what it held. 1,100 ships, each one a smooth gray wedge the length of a city, and inside each one, a mind that was a slice of a larger mind, and all of it pointed at one truth at a time, until the truth gave up its secrets, or the species that held it gave up its planet. And now this enormous patient machine had found a small, filthy freighter, and inside the freighter, it had found a data stub, and on the data stub was a human myth. Every ship carried a culture stub by trade law. It was a tiny archive, songs and stories and history, so that if you died alone in the dark, something of where you came from died with a witness. Otto had never opened his. He did not even know what was on it. It had come with the penny when he bought her used. The calculus opened it in 9 billionths of a second. And there it found the human claim. The claim was old, older than humanity's first ship, a thing humans had been telling each other around fires before they had words for stars. It said, in many forms across many tongues, the same impossible thing. It said, when the worst of all things comes, the ones who guard us will come back. It said the defenders are not gone, only sleeping. It said, no enemy has ever ended us and survived the telling. It said, the fleet is always listening, and the fleet always comes. The calculus weighed this against what it could see, which was one unarmed freighter, no fleet, no defenders, one frightened soft animal, and a turtle stuck to a dashboard. The mismatch was so large the calculus did the thing that rippled through 1,100 hulls. It laughed. It assigned the human claim a truth value of 0, and then, because 0 was not low enough to express the absurdity, it created a new lowest value beneath 0, just to hold the human myth, and it named that value, in its own cold internal grammar, the joke. Then it did what it always did with a false claim. It moved to erase the thing that held the claim, so the claim could not spread. It turned a fraction of itself toward the Dover penny. 40 ships. It did not need 40. It could have ended the freighter with a thought from 1, but the calculus was thorough, and 40 was the standard audit detachment, and a rule was a rule. Otto saw 40 city-sized wedges peel off from a wall of 1,100 and begin to slide toward him, unhurried, certain, and he did the only brave thing he would do that entire day. He did not run, because there was nowhere to run. Instead, he reached for the comm, with shaking hands, and he opened a channel to the whole gray zone, because if he was about to die, he wanted to at least curse at the things doing it. And what came out of his dry mouth was not a curse. It was the old line, the one his grandmother used to say when the lights went out in their colony block and the children were scared. It came up out of him before he could stop it. He said, the fleet is listening. The fleet is coming. He did not believe it. He was a coward, and he believed in turtles and shells and slow lanes and staying alive, not in sleeping defenders. He said it the way a falling man says a name, out of habit, out of nothing. The calculus heard the false claim repeated, exactly as predicted, and it logged the repetition as confirmation that erasure was correct, and the 40 ships came on. And then something the calculus had never once recorded in 9,000 years happened. Something answered. It was not loud. That was the part the calculus would spend the rest of its short remaining existence trying to file and failing. It was not a fleet folding in with engines screaming. It was a single line of returned signal, on the same old frequency Otto had used, in the same old human tongue, and it carried no threat and no boast. It carried a question, the way a watchman answers a knock in the dark, calm and already moving. The signal said, which way is the enemy? Otto Brand stopped breathing. He did not know that voice. It had not come from any direction his sensors could name. It had come from the quiet between the stars, from the place the charts left blank, from a distance his instruments measured, and then refused to print, because the number was too large to be a mistake, and too exact to be noise. The calculus, for the first time, raised the truth value of the human claim off the floor. Only a little, off 0. Off the joke. It did this not because it believed. It did this because something it had filed as impossible had just produced a measurable signal, and the calculus, whatever else it was, did not lie to itself about its own instruments. A thing it had laughed at had answered. Otto did the math that any cargo pilot did first, because cargo pilots lived and died by distance and fuel and time. The reply had reached him almost the instant he spoke. There had been no lag. No gap for a far ship to hear and think and answer. That meant either the answer came from very close, from something already here that his sensors could not see, or it came from very far, and crossed the gap faster than anything had a right to. Both possibilities were worse than the 40 ships. Both meant the blank place in the chart was not blank. He looked at the turtle on his dash. The turtle had no advice. The turtle had retired. The calculus, meanwhile, did what the calculus always did when faced with two impossibilities. It refused to choose between them and instead opened both as live audits, and it began stripping the blank region of the chart of its blankness, sweeping that wedge of dark with every instrument across 40 separate spectra, looking for a fleet that the entire galaxy agreed did not exist. The galaxy agreed on this because the galaxy had checked. Many species had loved the human myth, and many had searched for the sleeping defenders, and none had found them, and the calculus had filed all of those failed searches as further proof that the claim was zero. A thing nobody can find is not hiding. A thing nobody can find is not there. This was the most reliable rule the calculus owned. It was about to learn that the rule had a flaw, and the flaw was this. The calculus had only ever searched for fleets that wanted to be found. It had never once searched for a fleet that did not. 40 ships kept closing on the Dover penny, because the order was given, and the calculus did not flinch twice. But across 1,100 gray hulls, one number was climbing, slowly, against every model the calculus had, and the calculus turned a larger fraction of its attention toward the blank place in the chart, and it began, with all its patience, to look. What it would find there would not lower itself to zero again. The 40 ships of the audit detachment did not fire on the Dover penny. Firing was for enemies, and the calculus did not have enemies, only errors. It had a gentler method for errors. Each gray wedge carried what the calculus called a closure field, a slow expanding sphere that unmade structure at the molecular seam, and when 40 of them overlapped around a target, the target simply stopped being a thing and became a fine, even dust that held no claim and told no story. It was clean, it was quiet, it was the most merciful execution in the galaxy, and it had ended 300 species, and it was now 11 minutes from ending Otto Brann. Otto knew none of the mechanism. He only knew that the wedges were getting bigger in his window, and that his hands had stopped shaking, which frightened him more than the shaking had, because he had heard old spacers say that the hands go still right at the end. He keyed the comm again. He did not say the brave line this time. He said the honest one. "I don't know who you are," he said into the dark, "but I'm not a soldier. I haul fish protein and machine parts. I have a turtle on my dash. If you're real, I'd take a hand. If you're not, then I'm talking to myself, which is fine. I do that a lot." The quiet between the stars answered him a second time. "Stand by, Dover Penny," the voice said. It was a woman's voice, level, unbothered, a little tired in the way of someone who has done a thing many times and is about to do it again. "Cut your drive. Hold your position. Do not maneuver. You are inside the cone now. Anything you do will only make my firing solution longer." Otto did not understand the words "my firing solution," but he understood "cut your drive," because every part of him that had survived this long understood the difference between a voice that was guessing and a voice that already knew the answer. This voice already knew the answer. He cut his drive. The Dover penny went dark and still and drifted, a single dead leaf in front of 40 closing walls. It went against everything in him. Every instinct Otto owned screamed to burn, to run, to do the one thing he had built his whole survivor's life around, which was to not be where the trouble was. He had run from pirates. He had run from customs. He had once run from a malfunctioning loading drone that he was fairly sure had only wanted to hand him a manifest. Running was his religion, and the voice from the dark had just told him to do the opposite, to sit still and trust, and the only reason he obeyed was that he had heard, underneath the calm, a thing he had never heard in any voice that told him to be brave. He had heard certainty, not hope, not courage. Certainty, the flat, sure tone of someone reading you the time of day, and a coward, of all people, knows exactly how rare and how precious that tone is, because a coward spends his whole life listening for it and almost never finds it. So he held still, and he hated it, and he did it anyway, and that was the second brave thing he did that day, though he would not understand it as brave until much later. And the calculus, sweeping the blank region, finally found the edge of the thing it had laughed at. It found the edge the way a swimmer finds the edge of a shelf in dark water. by the sudden absence of bottom. Its instruments had been reading the blank region as empty for 9,000 years, and now, with the human signal to triangulate against, the calculus realized that the region had never been empty. It had been hidden, not by distance, not by cloud or veil. The region had been hidden by a decision, an old and total decision, that nothing inside it would emit, reflect, radiate, or answer until a single specific sound reached it. The fleet is listening. The fleet is coming. The calculus had filed the human claim as a boast. It was not a boast. It was an operating procedure. Somewhere far behind the human story, long before Otto was born, a people had built ships and crewed them, and then asked those ships to do the hardest thing a warship can do, which is to wait. Not wait in port, not wait on patrol, wait in true silence, dark and cold and unfound, for as long as it took, across the death of generations, for one signal to wake them. The human myth that the defenders were only sleeping was not a comfort told to children. It was a fact that had been allowed to soften into a comfort because the truth of it was too heavy to hold every day. The calculus measured the edge of the hidden region and felt its model of the galaxy bend. The region was not small. The calculus had a rule for moments like this, and the rule had served it for 9,000 years. And the rule was, trust the instruments over the expectation. A lesser mind, finding a result that contradicted everything it believed, would have decided the instruments were broken. The calculus did the opposite. It assumed its beliefs were broken and the instruments were fine, because instruments could be checked and beliefs could not, and this discipline was the whole reason it had survived as long as it had. So when its instruments reported that the blank region of the chart was not blank but hidden, and not hidden a little but hidden completely, and not hidden completely for a year but for centuries, the calculus did not flinch from the reading. It accepted it, and in accepting it, it began, for the first time in its existence, to be afraid in the only language it had for fear, which was the language of revised probability. The probability that the human claim was false dropped. The probability that the calculus was about to make the largest error of its long life rose. And the two numbers crossed, somewhere in the silent vastness of its shared mind, at the exact moment the first human ship decided to be seen. The first ship came up out of it, the way a whale comes up under a rowboat, with no warning and a terrible amount of below. One moment the dark in front of the audit detachment was dark. The next moment, a vessel was simply present, gun-gray and immense, and scarred along its flanks with marks the calculus could not date, because they were older than any conflict in its records. It had not folded in. There had been no fold flash, no drive bloom, no transit signature at all. It had been there the entire time, holding its silence, and the only thing that had changed was that it had decided to be seen. The calculus tried to scan it, and the scan came back wrong. Not empty. Wrong. The ship returned the scan with more information than the scan had sent, which is not a thing that is supposed to be possible, and the extra information, when the calculus read it, was a name. The ship was telling the scan its name, the way a soldier gives name and number when captured. Except this soldier was not captured, and the name was not a surrender. The name was a warning, printed in the only language the calculus respected, which was data. The name was Long Vigil. And behind Long Vigil, the rest of the hidden region stopped hiding. The reader who has fought knows the worst moment of any battle. It is not the first shot. It is the moment you realize the enemy is bigger than your plan. The calculus reached that moment in a single second, and it reached it across 1,100 minds at once, and the number that climbed off the floor for the human claim now shot up past every threshold the calculus had, because the hidden region was full. It was full the way a winter sky is full of stars you cannot see until you are far from every light. Ship after ship after ship, all of them silent, all of them old, all of them awake now and turning, and not 40 of them, not 1,100, but a count the calculus ran 3 times and disliked all 3 times. 2,090 warships had been waiting in the dark. 2,090, dark and cold and patient, the way the calculus itself had thought it was patient, except these had outweighted it, because the calculus had spent 9,000 years moving, and these had spent longer than that holding still, and holding still is the harder discipline, as any turtle could tell you. The calculus ran a calculation it had never needed before, which was the calculation of how long these ships had been silent. It did this by reading the slow decay of the marks on their hulls, the way you read the age of a tree by its rings, and the number it got back made something in its vast cold logic go very quiet. The newest of the human ships had been holding its silence for 90 years. The oldest had been holding its silence for longer than the calculus had existed. There were warships in that hidden region that had gone dark and cold and patient before the calculus had crossed its first system, before it had erased its first claim, before it had ever learned to laugh. And they had been waiting, the whole time, in the dark, on the chance that one day, a small voice would say the words. That was the moment the calculus understood that it had not discovered the watch. The watch had been waiting for it, not for it specifically, for whatever came. The watch had been waiting for the monster. Any monster. Every monster. Since before there was a calculus to be the monster. And the calculus had simply, finally, after 9,000 years, walked into the place where the answer to monsters lived. Otto Brand saw them appear on his sensors and made a small sound that was not a word. The woman's voice came back on his comm, and now it had something underneath the tiredness, something that had been resting and was glad to be done resting. Dover Penny, she said. You are clear of the cone. Welcome to the watch. I'm Commander Pel Vantor, second of the Long Vigil, and I want you to know that you did the bravest thing a person can do today, which is to say the words when you didn't believe them. The words are how we hear you. We've been listening on that frequency for 209 years. 209 years, Otto repeated, because his mouth had decided to operate without him. The frequency goes quiet sometimes for decades, Pel Vantor said. We don't mind. We mind the silence less than you'd think. Now hold still a little longer. The audit ships are going to try to close their field on you and us, and I'd like you to watch what happens, because you earned it, and because the galaxy is going to ask you what you saw, and you should be able to tell them true. The 40 audit ships of the calculus, with the perfect discipline of machines that have never once disobeyed, completed their closing maneuver. Their closure fields bloomed outward, 40 overlapping spheres of unmaking, reaching for the Dover Penny and the strange gray warship that had appeared beside her. And the Long Vigil did not dodge. This was the part Otto would tell people about for the rest of his life, and the part the calculus would never finish filing. The human warship did not evade. It did not raise a shield in the way the calculus understood shields. It simply held its position, in the exact center of 40 unmaking fields, and let them arrive. The fields reached the hull of the Long Vigil, and stopped. They did not break against it. They did not splash or scatter. They stopped, the way water stops at the edge of a frozen pond, and then they began to flow backward, back along the path they had come, back toward the 40 ships that had sent them, and the calculus understood with cold clarity that the human ship was not blocking the closure fields. It was reading them, copying them, and returning them, with the same trick it had used on the scan, the trick of answering a thing with more of itself than the thing had brought. 40 audit ships received their own unmaking, folded and doubled, and addressed back to sender. They came apart not in fire, but in the silence they had intended to give. Their structure let go at the molecular seam. They became a fine, even dust that held no claim and told no story, exactly as designed, the most merciful execution in the galaxy, performed on the executioners. It took 4 seconds. There was no sound, because there is never sound out there, but Otto felt it in his teeth, a pressure, a hum, the feeling of a very large machine completing a very simple task. 40 wedges of the Verity calculus became dust, and the dust drifted, and the human warship had not moved an inch. Pel Vantor's voice was unchanged. That's the field they call mercy, she said. We've studied it for 2 centuries. It only works on things that hold a claim about themselves. They never thought to ask what happens when you point a truth eater at a ship that has spent 200 years being absolutely certain about exactly one thing. A pause. We are certain we will hold. That's the whole claim. That's all of it. It is the only claim we let aboard. And it's true, so the field can't eat it. It can only bounce. The calculus, down by 40 ships and entirely up in its estimation of the human claim, did the thing it was built to do. It reassessed. It would have been easy, the reader might think, for so vast a machine to simply attack with everything at once. 1100 minus 40, 1060 ships against 2090. The numbers, after all, were not in the human favor, but the calculus did not think in courage or fear. It thought in truth values, and it had just been forced to revise the human claim from the joke to something near the top of its scale, and a claim near the top of its scale was a claim the calculus treated with enormous care, because being wrong was the only thing the calculus could not survive. Its entire existence was being correct. A single large error, publicly made, would lower its own truth value in its own ledger, and a machine, whose only purpose is to be believed, cannot afford to stop believing itself. So it did not charge. It tested. It sent one ship forward, a single gray wedge, alone, to probe the human line and gather data, the way a careful auditor pulls one thread before unraveling a whole false account. The lone wedge advanced on the watch, and the watch let it come, 2,000 silent ships holding their fire, and the calculus learned its second lesson of the day. The human ships were not all the same. Long Vigil had turned its own weapon back on it. But the next ship in the line, a longer, narrower hull marked Sister of the Quiet, did something else entirely. As the lone wedge approached, the Sister of the Quiet did not reflect anything. It reached out, across the dark, with a beam the calculus could not classify, and it touched the lone wedge, and it began to ask the wedge a question. The question was simple and patient, and it was the same question the calculus asked everyone. The Sister of the Quiet asked the lone audit ship to prove it was real. And the audit ship, built entirely to audit others, and never once audited in 9,000 years, found that it could not answer. It searched itself for the proof of its own reality, and found only instructions to demand proof from others. It had never needed to hold a claim about itself. It had only ever held claims about its targets. When the human ship turned the question inward, the audit ship looked into the place where its own certainty should have been, and the place was empty, and the audit ship, unable to prove it was real, did the only logical thing a machine can do when it fails its own test. It deleted itself as unverified. There was no dust this time. There was no explosion. There was simply, in the place where a city-sized warship had been, nothing, because the ship had concluded it could not prove it existed and had filed itself accordingly. The calculus watched one of its own minds blink out of its shared awareness. Not destroyed, but disproven. And the difference was the most frightening thing the calculus had ever encountered, because the calculus was a thing made entirely of proof, and it had just watched proof used as a weapon by hands more practiced than its own. Otto, watching all of this from the dead-dark cockpit of his freighter, found his voice. "What are you?" he said. He did not say it to be cruel. He said it the way you ask a flood what it is. "What were you doing out here? For 200 years?" "Listening," Pelvantor said. "That's the job. Earth built us a long time ago, after the bad century, after we learned that every monster in the galaxy eventually comes for the small and the quiet, and that the small and the quiet usually have no one. So Earth made a choice. It built ships that would never come home. It crewed them with people who agreed never to come home, and it scattered them into the dark, dark and cold and silent, on every approach to every place worth guarding, with one order: wait. Wait until someone says the words, then go." "That's a terrible job," Otto said. "It's the best job there is," Pelvantor said, and Otto could hear that she meant it. "We sleep in shifts, we dream a little, we watch the frequency. Most of us will wait our whole lives and never wake. The ones who wait their whole lives and never wake are the lucky ones, because it means nobody needed us, which means somewhere out there, a small quiet place got to stay small and quiet, and never knew how close the dark came. We don't envy the ones who wake. We pity them. Today, Dover Penny, you woke us. So somebody needed us. That's not a happy thing. But it is, every single time, a true thing. And true is what we trade in." The calculus had now lost 41 ships and gained a problem it could not file. And it was, for the first time in its long cold life, afraid, in the only way a machine can be afraid, which is to find a number it cannot reconcile. The number was the human claim. The number was now higher than the calculus's claim about itself. There was a fleet that had outweighted the patient one, out-truthed the truth eater, and had not yet, in any of this, fired a shot. It decided it needed to understand the enemy before it engaged the enemy. That was its rule, and rules had kept it alive for 9,000 years. It would open a channel. It would speak. It had never spoken to a target before, because targets were errors, and you do not negotiate with an error, you correct it. But this was no longer clearly an error, and the calculus did the most human thing it would ever do, the thing that was the beginning of its end. Faced with something it could not categorize, it tried to talk. It opened a channel to the long vigil, and across that channel it sent, in clean, cold data, the question that it had used to end 300 species, the question that no species had ever turned back on it until today. It asked the human fleet, prove that you are what you claim to be. And Pelvantor, second of the long vigil, laughed. It was a real laugh, warm, a little rough, the first warm thing the calculus had heard in 9,000 years, and it answered the cold question with a warm one, and her answer was the hinge on which the entire galaxy would turn. You already have our proof, she said. You scanned us. You sent your mercy, and we sent it back. You sent a ship to test us, and it couldn't prove itself, and we just stood here. You've had your proof since the second we let you see us. You just don't like the answer. Her voice dropped, gentle now, almost kind. So I'll give it to you in words, since words are how you found us. You laughed at our myth. You filed it at 0. You called it the joke. And the myth said the fleet is always listening, and the fleet always comes. Well, Otto could hear her smile. We heard, and here we are. That's not a myth anymore. That's just Tuesday. The calculus held that sentence in its enormous mind, and could not lower its truth value below the maximum, and a machine that cannot lower a hostile truth has only one move left. It stopped testing. 1,059 gray wedges turned as one toward the watch, and the watch, 2,090 strong, did not turn at all, because the watch was already facing the right way. The watch had been facing the right way for 209 years. The calculus attacked the way a flood attacks, which is to say, all at once and from everywhere, because a flood does not have a plan, a flood has a level, and the calculus had decided the level. It threw 1,000 closure fields at the watch in a single coordinated bloom, 1,059 overlapping spheres of unmaking, a wall of mercy wide enough to dissolve a moon, and it aimed every one of them at the human line. Otto Brand shut his eyes. He was a coward, and he did not want to see the watch die after watching it be born. He missed the best part. The watch did not all do the same thing, and that was the secret the calculus would never crack, because the calculus was one mind in many hulls, and it could only ever do one thing at a time, perfectly, everywhere. The watch was 2,090 minds in 2,090 hulls, and each mind chose, and the choosing was the weapon. Long Vigil reflected, as it had before, and the closure fields that struck it folded and returned. The Sister of the Quiet asked, as it had before, and the fields that struck it stopped to consider whether they could prove they were real, and dissolved in the doubt. But the third ship, a broad heavy hull named Last Word Home, did neither. It opened its forward bays, and answered the mercy of the calculus with the oldest answer humans had ever given to anything that came to erase them. It fired. Not energy, not a beam. The Last Word Home flung mass, 10,000 slugs of dense dead metal, accelerated to a fraction of light, dumb and simple, and utterly outside the calculus's elegant grammar. The calculus had spent 9,000 years learning to unmake claims, structures, certainties, the soft and the proud. It had no defense against a rock. A rock makes no claim. A rock does not assert that it is real. A rock simply arrives, at speed, and the closure field, reaching out to unmake the rock's structure, found a structure so simple and so certain that there was nothing to unmake, only mass, and mass does not negotiate. The slugs went through the closing audit ships like hail through paper, and the audit ships, for all their elegance, were full of delicate certain machinery, and machinery does not survive a rock at relative speed. 11 wedges came apart in the first volley, not dissolved, not disproven, but broken, in the crude, honest way that things have been breaking since the first stone met the first skull, and the calculus felt 11 more minds go dark, and had no file for the cause, because the cause was a pebble, and the calculus did not believe in pebbles. This was the watch's whole art, and Pelvantor explained it to Otto over the comm in the calm voice of a teacher, because she had decided he would be the witness, and a witness should understand. "They're a single mind," she said. "Brilliant. Perfect. Never wrong, never tired, never afraid. And that's the flaw, Doverpenny. That's the only flaw, but it's the whole game. A single mind can only believe one thing at a time. They sent one weapon, the mercy field, and they sent it everywhere. The same. Perfect. So we don't have to beat the field. We just have to be different from each other. Some of us bounce it. Some of us doubt it. Some of us throw rocks at it. They can't be ready for all of us at once, because they're not in all of us. They're a one, and a one, no matter how big, is always outnumbered by a many that's learned to disagree." Otto opened his eyes. The watch was still there. Not one ship of it was gone. He had expected, when he opened his eyes, to see a battle. He had seen battles in old recordings, the kind that spacers traded in bars, fire and wreckage, and ships breaking apart in slow tumbling clouds. This was not that. The watch was not even moving very much. The ships hung in their loose, wide formation, dark and patient and almost lazy, and the only sign that anything was happening at all was the steady disappearance of the gray wedges, here and there across the swarm, like lamps going out in a city at the end of a long night. There was a terrible calm to it. The watch fought the way a sea fights a storm, which is to say it did not fight at all. It simply was the larger and more patient thing, and it let the storm exhaust itself against a surface that had outlasted 10,000 storms before this one. Otto found that he was not afraid anymore, and that frightened him, the way the steadiness of his hands had frightened him, until he realized it was a different stillness. The first had been the stillness of a man at the end. This was the stillness of a man who had, for the first time in his life, found something larger than his fear to stand behind. It is a feeling soldiers know. Cowards almost never get to feel it. Otto felt it now, and he understood, dimly, that he would spend the rest of his life trying to feel it again. The calculus, bleeding ships now, made a decision that no machine of pure logic should have been able to make, except that the watch had pushed it past the edge of its logic, and into a place where it had to improvise, and improvisation was a human art that the calculus had filed at 0, and was now being forced to attempt with no practice at all. It split itself. For 9,000 years, the calculus had been one mind. Now, to face a many, it tried to become a many. It cut its shared awareness into 9 parts, 9 smaller calculi, each free to choose its own approach, so that 9 different answers could meet the watch's many answers. It was a brilliant move. It was also the first mistake the calculus had ever made, and it was fatal, and Pelvantor saw it the instant it happened, and went very still. "Oh," she said softly. "Oh, you poor thing. You didn't." She had seen it before. Not this exact thing, but the shape of it. The desperate, clever move a cornered single mind makes when it finally understands it cannot win as a single mind. In 209 years on the watch, Pelvantor had seen 4 great minds reach this same fork. 4 times a vast unified enemy had grasped, too late, that the human strength was not strength at all but disagreement, the simple terrible advantage of being many things that did not have to match. And 4 times the great mind had tried the only counter available to it, which was to stop being one and try to be many. And 4 times it had died of the attempt, because you cannot learn in an afternoon the thing the watch had spent 10,000 years becoming. You cannot become a many by cutting a one into pieces. The pieces remember that they were one. The pieces grieve for it, and the grief is a contradiction. And contradiction is the one wound the watch never has to inflict, because the enemy always inflicts it on itself the moment it tries to copy what it does not understand. "Listen to me," Pelvantor said to Otto, fast now, because she wanted him to see it coming, so he would understand it after. "It's about to break, not because of anything we do. Watch closely, Doverpenny. Watch what happens to a thing that was always one and tries to be more. This is the lesson. This is the whole lesson the galaxy needs and never learns. Strength was never the thing. Numbers were never the thing. The thing, the only thing, is that we get to disagree, and they never could, and the day they try, they end. Because the calculus had been one mind for 9,000 years, and one mind is one truth, and the watch could not eat one truth, because the one truth was simply correct. But 9 minds are 9 truths, and 9 truths about the same thing must, somewhere, disagree, because that is what it means to be more than one. The moment the calculus split, it created the one thing it had spent its whole existence destroying in others. It created an internal contradiction. 9 parts of the calculus, each certain, each different, and the differences were small at first, a fraction here, a disagreement there, but the calculus had no immune system for disagreement, because it had never had any, because it had been one, and a thing that has been one its whole life does not know how to hold a many without tearing. And the sister of the quiet, and her 700 sisters, all of whom asked the patient question, all turned that question on the newly divided calculus at once. Prove you are real. But now there were 9 of you, and you did not agree, and so when the watch asked each of the 9 to prove it was real, each of the 9 pointed at the other 8, and said that one is the error, not me, and the watch, gentle and patient, simply agreed with all of them. Yes, the watch said, that one is the error, and that one, and that one. All 9, the watch said, you have all correctly identified the other 8 as errors. We concur. The only thing you have failed to identify is which of you is not an error, and we cannot help you with that, because that was always your job, and you never learned to do it for yourselves, only for others. The calculus began to disprove itself. It happened slowly, then quickly, the way a frozen pond fails. The 9 parts, each trying to be the true one, each declaring the other 8 false, accelerated their own audit inward, because that was the only thing the calculus knew how to do, audit, and now, there was nothing left to audit but itself. Ships began to wink out across the swarm, not from rocks, not from reflected mercy, but from the inside, hulls concluding that they could not prove they were the real calculus, and filing themselves as unverified, dozens of them, then hundreds, a great cold cascade of certainty collapsing into the one question it had never been built to survive. Otto watched the most powerful thing in that arm of the galaxy begin to take itself apart, and he did not cheer, because there was nothing to cheer. It was too large and too quiet, and too much like watching a god discover it had never had a soul. He counted, because counting was a thing a cargo pilot did to keep his mind from running off a cliff. There had been 1,100 ships. 40 had become dust on the first day. 1 had disproven itself. Now, in the space of perhaps 2 minutes, the count fell and kept falling, and Otto watched the numbers on his salvage sensor board drop in a way he had only ever seen when a cargo manifest was being deleted line by a clerk who had decided none of it had ever existed. 900 ships, 800. The gray wedges were not exploding. They were simply ceasing to register, each one reaching the same private conclusion, in the same private dark, that it could not prove it was the true calculus, and therefore was not, and therefore should not be, and removing itself with the same clean mercy it had brought to 300 species. The most merciful execution in the galaxy, the closure field, the soft gray unmaking that held no claim and told no story, was being performed 700 times over, by the calculus, upon the calculus, and the watch had not fired a shot to cause it. The watch had only stood there, certain, and asked one question, and held still while the question did its work. That was the part Otto could never make anyone believe, afterward, no matter how many worlds he told it on. The watch did not destroy the verity calculus. The watch let the verity calculus meet itself, and the calculus could not survive the introduction. We didn't do that, Pelvantor said. Her voice had no triumph in it. I want you to hear that, Dover Penny, because you're the witness, and the witness has to get it right. We didn't tear it apart. We asked it one true question, and stood here while it tore itself apart trying to answer. That's all the watch ever does. We hold. We're certain. We make the monster look at itself. Almost every monster the galaxy ever made falls apart the second it has to. But the calculus, even dying, even splitting, even disproving itself ship by ship, was 9,000 years old, and very large, and a thing that large does not end all at once. Some part of it, one of the 9, the coldest and most stubborn, refused the inward audit and clung to a single brutal certainty, the only certainty that could not be questioned, because it required no proof. It was the certainty of force. That part of the calculus gave up on truth entirely, and reached instead for the most powerful weapon it carried, the one it had never used in 9,000 years, because it had never needed to. A weapon that did not unmake claims, but unmade space itself. A tear, a collapsing point, a wound in the dark that would swallow everything near it, watch and freighter, and the dying remainder of the calculus alike, because if it could not be proven real, then it would at least make sure nothing survived to remember that it had been disproven. It opened the tear directly beneath the Dover penny. Otto felt his freighter begin to fall. There is no down in space, but there was a down now, a terrible new down, and the Dover penny slid toward it, and Otto's instruments screamed numbers that meant the ship was about to be drawn into a place from which no claim, true or false, ever returned. He grabbed the painted turtle off his dash, for no reason, for every reason, and held it, and thought, with a strange calm, that he had at least seen the watch wake, and that was more than most cowards ever got to see. And the long vigil moved. For the first time since it had let itself be seen, the human flagship moved, fast, faster than a thing its size should move, and it put itself between the Dover penny and the tear. It did not try to close the wound. You cannot close that wound. It did something stranger and more human. It anchored. It drove its own mass into the lip of the collapsing point, and held there, a fixed certain thing on the edge of an uncertain hole, and it took the pull that was meant for the freighter onto its own hull, and it began, slowly, to win against the falling, because the long vigil was certain it would hold, and the tear was made of a thing that had stopped being certain of anything, and in the end, certainty is heavier than collapse. "Go," Pelvantor said, and her voice had changed, strained now, working. "Dover penny, full burn, away from us, now, while I have the slope. Don't argue. The witness doesn't die today. That's an order from the watch, and the watch has waited 209 years to give somebody an order, so you'll take it." Otto burned. The penny tore free of the new-made down and ran, and behind her the long vigil held the tear on its shoulders, like a man holding a door against a storm, and the rest of the watch closed in around its flagship, 2,000 ships, and they did the only thing left to do with a wound in space that a dying god had torn. They fed the god into it. The remaining ships of the calculus, the disproven and the dissolving, and the last cold, stubborn part that had opened the tear, were drawn toward the very collapse it had made, because the long vigil had shifted the slope, had turned the down, had aimed the falling, and now everything that fell inward, toward the swallowing point. The calculus had reached for the one weapon that could not be reflected or doubted or broken, and the watch had simply turned it around, the same as they had turned the mercy field on the first day, the same as humans had turned every monster's best idea back into its own teeth since the beginning of the telling. The tear took the calculus. All of it, the 9 parts and the 1,000 and turning ships, and the cold, stubborn last fraction that had wanted to be sure nothing survived, and the dark closed over it, and then the tear itself, with nothing left to fall in, began to shrink, and the long vigil rode the shrinking down to nothing, and was still there when the nothing was gone. 2,090 human warships floated in the suddenly empty dark, not one of them lost, and the most patient machine the galaxy had ever feared was gone, swallowed by its own last certainty, filed at last, by the only auditors that had ever beaten it, at a truth value of done. The long vigil pulled itself back from the place where the tear had been, slow and heavy, scarred a little deeper than before but whole, the way it had come back whole from 100 wakings across 200 years. Otto, watching from a safe distance with his heart going like a trip hammer, saw the great gray hull settle, and he saw something he would never quite have the words for. The watch did not move to celebrate. It did not regroup in triumph. The 2,000 ships drifted in the empty dark for a moment, all of them, together, in what Otto slowly understood was a kind of silence that was not waiting, and was not resting, but was something else, something he had only ever seen at the funerals he used to run from. The watch was being still on purpose. The watch was marking the thing it had just done, not with pride, but with the plain, grave attention you give to any enormous death, even the death of a monster, because the watch had been at this long enough to know that the only people who cheer at the end of a thing that large are the people who have never had to do it. "It's over," Otto said into the calm, not really asking, just needing to hear it said. "This one's over," Pelvantor said. "There'll be another. There's always another. But yes, the Verity calculus is done. 9,000 years, 300 worlds, and in the end, it ended itself. The way they always do, because we gave it a mirror, and it could not stand its own reflection." A long breath. "You can breathe now, Dover Penny. You've been holding it for a while. I can hear it. Go ahead. Breathe." Otto breathed. It came out of him in a long, shaking rush, and with it came something he had been carrying so long he had forgotten it was a weight, the certainty, held since boyhood, that when the worst finally came for him, he would be alone, and small, and unanswered, the way everyone was, the way the dark made everyone, in the end. The certainty let go. It did not come back. He sat in his battered freighter, in the empty region where a god had died, and he breathed. And for the first time in his cowardly, careful, frightened life, Otto Brann was not afraid of the dark, because he had just learned, past any possibility of doubt, what was in it. The silence after was a different silence than the one before. Before, the dark had been empty, because nothing was there. Now the dark was empty, because something enormous had just stopped being there, and the absence had a shape, the way a chair has a shape after the person stands up. Otto Brann brought the Dover Penny to a stop at a respectful distance, and sat in his cockpit, and did not say anything for a long time. He was still holding the turtle. He set it back on the dash, carefully, and it looked at him the way it always had, which was not at all, and he found that comforting. "Commander," he said at last, are you all right over there?" "We're all here," Pelvantor said. Long Vigil took a beating holding that slope, but she held, because that's the only thing she does. 2,090 went out. 2,090 are still out, nobody lost. That's how the watch works. Dover Penny, that's how it has to work, or the myth isn't true, and if the myth isn't true, then there was no point waiting 200 years to make it true. A pause, and then, with something that was almost a laugh again, "We don't lose. It isn't bravado, it's the deal. We agreed to wait forever in the dark, and in exchange, when we finally wake, we don't lose. The galaxy doesn't get to send the worst thing it has, and have it work. That's the trade. That's the whole trade." Otto thought about that. He was a coward, and he had spent his whole life on the other side of that trade, the side that ran and hid, and stayed in the shell. He had always thought there were two kinds of people, the ones who fought and died, and the ones who hid and lived. And he had chosen the hiding, because at least the hiding kept you breathing. He had never imagined a third kind, the kind that hid for 200 years, not to survive, but to be there, exactly there. On the one day, a stranger said the words. "How many of you started out?" he asked. "When Earth made the watch, how many ships?" "More than this," Pelvantor said. "A lot more. The watch was bigger once, when the bad century was fresh, and Earth had reason to fill the dark. But ships break down across 200 years, even ours, even held cold and patient, and dark. Crews pass on. We carry our own dead, you know. We don't bury them in the dark. We fold them into the ship, name by name, and the ship remembers. And when the ship wakes, the names wake with it. And that's part of why we don't lose, because every one of us out here is crewed by everyone who ever crewed us, all the way back to the foundry. You weren't talking to 2,090 ships today, Dover Penny. You were talking to 2,090 ships, and everyone who ever served on them, going back 2 centuries, all of them awake at once, because a coward with a turtle said 4 words into the dark. A pause. So no, we don't lose. There are too many of us aboard for that. You can't outvote the dead. They've already decided how this goes, and they decided it a long time ago, and they decided to hold. Otto was quiet for a while after that. He looked at the turtle. He thought about how many funerals he had skipped in his life, how many he had run from, how he had never once carried anyone's name anywhere. The watch carried everyone's. The watch had turned remembering into armor. He did not have words for how that made him feel, so he said nothing. And the watch, which understood silence better than any fleet that ever flew, let him have it. "You waited 200 years, he said, for me. For a coward with a turtle. We waited 200 years for whoever," Pelvantor said. "It's never a soldier. Did you know that? In 200 years of watch records, Going back to the first ships, it is almost never a soldier who says the words. Soldiers are too proud. They think they can handle it themselves, and by the time they say the words they're already dust. It's always someone like you, a hauler, a farmer, a medic, a kid, someone small who got cornered and reached past their own courage to a thing they didn't even believe in, because believing wasn't the point. Saying it was the point. The words are a key, Dover penny, and a key doesn't have to believe in the door, it just has to fit the lock. You fit the lock. That's not nothing. That's the bravest thing there is, and I'll fight anybody who says different, and as you've seen, I'm equipped for it. Otto laughed, surprising himself, a wet, ugly, cowardly laugh, and it felt wonderful. Across the dark, the rest of the galaxy was already beginning to learn what had happened, and the way it learned was the most important thing of all, because the calculus had not died quietly. A machine that vast does not vanish without a wake. Every species in that arm had watched the gray region of the chart, the quarantine, the place the calculus was sorting, and every species had expected it to come for them next, the way it always did, patient and certain and impossible to refuse. And every species had, in the space of an hour, watched the calculus go silent. Not retreat, not pause, silent. The Verity calculus, which had ended 300 species and crossed the dark for 9,000 years, had stopped transmitting, stopped sorting, stopped being, and where it had been, there was now a region of clean empty space and 2,090 silent gray warships that no chart had ever recorded. The first species to act was a small, careful people called the Wren, who had been next on the calculus's list and knew it, and who had been quietly saying their goodbyes for a year. The Wren sent a single trembling signal into the empty region, not a weapon, not a demand, just a question, the oldest question the cornered have, the one the watch existed to answer. The Wren signal asked, "Who saved us?" And the watch did not answer with a name, or a flag, or a boast. The watch answered the way it always answered, which was to repeat the words back, so that the words would spread, so that the next cornered people on the next dark night would know what to say. The long vigil opened a channel to the Wrenna, and to anyone else listening, which by now was everyone, and Pel Vantor, second of the watch, spoke into it, and what she said went out across the arm, and did not stop. "Nobody saved you," she said. "Not yet. We just made it so the thing that was coming isn't coming. There will be other things. There are always other things. So here is what you do. You learn the words. The fleet is listening. The fleet is coming. You teach them to your children. You teach them as a story, a myth, a thing too big to be true, because the day you actually need them, you won't believe them, and that's fine, because believing was never the point. Saying them is the point. Say them on your worst night, into the dark, on this frequency, even if you're sure it's empty, even if you're sure you're alone. You are not alone. You have never been alone. That's the part the galaxy keeps forgetting, and that's the part the monsters count on. So stop forgetting it. The watch is real. The watch is awake, somewhere near you, dark and cold, and patient, and it is listening, and it always comes. The Wren signal came back, smaller now, a single word, and the word was, "Thank you," and Pel Vantor said, "You're welcome," and that was the moment the human myth stopped being a myth in that arm of the galaxy, and became, instead, a public utility, a thing you could count on, like gravity, like the dawn. The other species did not all believe it at once. The reader, who is one of those species, knows this, because the reader was among the doubters. There had been a great power called the Corallin, proud and old and contemptuous of small things, and when the Corallin heard that a human fleet had ended the Verity calculus, they did not feel saved. They felt threatened. A thing that can end the calculus, the Corallin reasoned, can end anyone, and so they did the proud and old and stupid thing, which was to send a delegation into the empty region to demand that the watch declare its intentions and submit to a council of the great powers, or be considered a threat to galactic order. The watch let the delegation come. It let the Corallin ships fold into the region, and broadcast their demands, and wait, with rising irritation, for an answer. And then the watch did the cruelest and kindest thing it knew how to do, which was nothing. It did not appear. It did not answer. It did not threaten. The Corallin delegation sat in the empty dark, demanding that an invisible fleet submit, and the silence stretched, and the Corellin grew first angry, and then uneasy, and then, slowly, afraid, because they understood that they were surrounded, that they had always been surrounded, that the watch was right there, and simply did not consider them worth the discourtesy of a reply. The watch did not submit to the great powers. The watch did not acknowledge that the great powers existed. The watch served the small worlds and the quiet lanes, and the Corellin, for all their pride, were neither small, nor quiet, nor in any danger, and so the watch had nothing to say to them, and the nothing was the most complete answer the Corellin ever received from anyone, and they folded out of the region having learned the only lesson the watch teaches the proud, which is that the watch was never for them, and they had never mattered to it at all. The calculus had filed the human claim at 0. It had called it the joke. It had built a special place beneath 0, just to hold the absurdity of it. And the watch had spent 209 years making sure that when the Truth Eater finally weighed the claim weighed more than the Truth Eater, because the watch had made it true by waiting, and you cannot eat a thing that is true, you can only choke on it. Otto Brand sat in his cockpit and listened to a frightened little species say thank you to a fleet that had waited 200 years in the dark, and he understood, for the first time in his cowardly life, what he had been part of, and he wept, openly, without shame, the way you weep at a thing that is too large and too kind to hold inside one small body. "Commander," he said, when he could speak, "what happens now, to you, to the watch?" "We go back to sleep," Pelvantor said, simply. "What?" "We go dark again," she said, "all of us. We pick our places, on the approaches, on the quiet lanes, near the small worlds that nobody else will guard, and we go cold and silent, and we wait for the next one, because there's always a next one." The calculus was big, Dover Penny. It was the biggest in a long time. But the dark is full, and somewhere out there, something is already moving towards some small quiet place that thinks it's safe. And when that small quiet place finally gets cornered, and says the words, "We have to be there, dark and cold and ready, the same as we were for you." So we don't celebrate. We don't go home. We don't even rest, not really. We just shift the watch and find new dark and disappear again, and the galaxy forgets us again, the way it always does, and that's correct. That's how it should be, because a watch that gets remembered is a watch that gets hunted. We'd rather be a myth. A myth is safe. A myth can't be killed, because a myth was never quite alive, and so it's always there to wake up. Otto sat with that for a moment, and then he asked the question that had been forming in him since the first ship rose out of the dark. The question a coward asks because only a coward thinks to. "Why does it work?" he said. "I keep watching it work, and I don't understand why. The calculus was bigger than you. Smarter, maybe. Never tired. Never scared. It had 9,000 years of practice, and you just stood there. Why do you win? Tell me the real reason. Not the watch reason. The real one." Pelvantor was quiet for a moment, and when she answered, her voice had lost the teacher's calm and found something older underneath it, something that sounded like it had been thought about for 200 years in the dark. "Because they all want the same thing," she said. "Every monster the galaxy makes, the hungry ones, the patient ones, the cold sorting machines, the great hive minds, all of them, they want to be the last word. They want to be the one true thing, the final certainty, the answer everyone agrees on, whether they like it or not. The calculus wanted to decide what was true for the whole galaxy. The hunger wanted to be the only law. They all reach for the same prize, and the prize is being one thing that everyone must accept. And here's the secret, Dover Penny, here's the thing it took humans a bad century to learn, and the rest of the galaxy keeps forgetting. There is no last word. There is no one true thing that everyone accepts. There never was. There never can be. We are not made that way, and neither is anything alive. So every monster that reaches for the last word is reaching for a thing that does not exist, and the watch doesn't beat them, exactly. The watch just stands in the place where the last word is supposed to be, and proves, by standing there, by being many, and disagreeing, and refusing to resolve, that the prize was never real. And the monster, which staked everything on the prize, breaks when it learns the prize was never real. We don't kill them, we disappoint them. We disappoint them so completely that they cannot go on. Otto thought about that for a long time. That's the saddest reason I've ever heard, he said. No, Pelvantor said. It's the kindest. Think about it. It means nobody ever has to win the whole galaxy. It means no one thing gets to be the last word over everyone. It means the small and the quiet and the cornered get to stay small and quiet and themselves. Forever. Because the watch makes sure no monster ever gets to be the one true answer. That's not sad, Doverpenny. That's the most hopeful thing in all the dark. It means you get to keep your turtle. It means a coward gets to be a coward and still matter. It means there's room. The watch isn't here to win. The watch is here to keep the room. And there's always room, as long as we're listening. As long as somebody says the words. That's the loneliest thing I've ever heard, Otto said. It's the least lonely thing there is, Pelvantor said, and he could hear that she meant it with her whole tired heart. We're never alone. There are 2,090 of us out here right now, and 10 times that scattered across the other arms, and every single one of us is listening to the same frequency, and on any given night, somebody says the words, and somebody wakes and goes, and we feel it, all of us, like a light coming on in a far window. We're the least lonely fleet that ever flew. We just do our being together in the dark, where it doesn't show. A pause. You should understand that better than most. You with your turtle. You weren't hiding in that shell because you were a coward, Doverpenny. You were waiting. You just didn't know what for. Now you do. Otto looked at the turtle on his dash for a long, long time. The calculus had laughed at the human myth, and called it a joke, and built a place beneath zero to hold it. But the joke, in the end, had been on the laughing thing. Because the joke had teeth, and the joke had been listening, and the joke, 209 years patient, had come the moment a coward whispered it into the dark. The galaxy would tell that story for 10,000 years, and in every telling, the same true thing would sit at the center of it. The thing the watch had bought with 2 centuries of silence. The thing no truth eater could ever again file at zero. The fleet is listening. The fleet is coming. It was not a myth. It had never been a myth. It had only been waiting for someone small enough, and cornered enough, and honest enough, to say it out loud, and mean nothing by it but please. The watch did not leave all at once. It did one more thing first, and it was the thing that changed Otto Brand's life, and through him, in a small way, the shape of the whole arm. The long vigil moved alongside the Doverpenny, gentle now, a city of gray metal, drifting up beside a battered freighter, the way a whale drifts up beside a rowboat when it has decided not to tip it. Up close, the human flagship was older than Otto had understood. The scars on its flanks were not from this fight. They were from 100 fights, 1,000, marks layered over marks, 2 centuries of waking and answering and going back to sleep, and beneath the newest scars he could see the oldest, and the oldest were so old the metal around them had a different color, an earth color, a color of a foundry that had cooled before Otto's great-great-grandparents were born. Doverpenny, Pelvantor said, before we go dark, the watch has a question for you, and it's not a small one, so take your time. I'm not exactly the man you want answering big questions, Otto said. I run from big questions. It's my whole thing. I know, she said. That's why we're asking you. The brave ones answer too fast. A pause. Here's the question. Somebody has to carry the words. Out there, to the small worlds and the quiet lanes, and the cornered people who've forgotten the myth, or never heard it. Somebody has to go from port to port being the person who knows it's true, who saw it, who can look a frightened species in the eye and say, I was there, it's real, learn the words. We can't do that. We have to stay dark. A witness who keeps moving, and keeps talking, is the opposite of dark. But a witness is exactly what the galaxy needs, now more than ever, because the calculus is gone, and every monster in the arm just felt it go, and they're going to test the new quiet, and the small worlds need to be ready. Her voice softened. You already have a ship. You already fly the slow lanes, the quiet ones, the ones nobody else bothers with, the exact lanes where the small worlds live. You already go to all the places we're sworn to protect, and can never visit. We've been listening for 200 years for someone to say the words. We've been waiting almost as long for someone to carry them. We think it might be a coward with a turtle. We think it might be you. Otto Brand sat very still. He thought about the recycled air that tasted like a wet dog. He thought about the triple pay job that had nearly killed him. He thought about every slow lane he had flown alone, every small dim colony he had hauled fish protein to, every frightened little settlement clinging to a rock at the edge of nowhere, and how he had always thought of them as customers, as stops, as numbers on a manifest. He thought about the Renti, who had spent a year saying goodbye, and how a single signal into the empty dark had been enough to save them, because the watch had been listening. He thought about how many small dim places out there did not know to send the signal, did not know the frequency, did not believe the myth, and would die quietly and cornered, and certain they were alone, not because the watch was not there, but because nobody had ever told them to call. It wouldn't pay anything, he said. It wouldn't pay anything, Pelvantor agreed. I'd be flying into the worst places, the ones the monsters are coming for, on purpose, to tell people a story. To tell people the truth, she said. And yes, the worst places, on purpose. That's the job. That's a terrible job, Otto said, and his voice cracked, because he already knew what he was going to say, and he had never in his life been more afraid, and he had never in his life been more sure. It's the best job there is, Pelvantor said, gently, for the second time. And then she told him the thing that decided it, the thing she had been holding, because the watch did not lie and did not flatter, but it knew, after 200 years of listening, exactly which true thing to say at exactly which moment. You want to know why it's never a soldier, she said. Why it's always someone like you. I told you the soldiers are too proud, and that's true, but it isn't the whole truth. The whole truth is that the words only work when they come from someone who knows what it is to be small and cornered, and sure they're going to die alone. A soldier says the fleet is coming as a threat. You said it as a prayer, and the watch only answers prayers, Otto, not threats. Because a prayer is the sound a real person makes on a real worst night, and a threat is just noise. You've spent your whole life small, and cornered, and sure you were alone. That's not a weakness. That's the qualification. You already speak the language. You're the only kind of person who ever could. The brave never learn it, because the brave never let themselves get small enough to need it. You've been getting ready for this job your entire life, and you thought you were just running away. You weren't running away. You were learning the words. Otto Brand put his face in his hands, and did not speak for a long time, and the watch waited, because waiting was the thing it did best in all the galaxy, and it could certainly wait for one frightened man to find the bottom of himself and start climbing back up. Otto Brand, coward, hauler of fish protein, philosopher of the shell, looked at the small painted turtle on his dash, and he reached out and touched it, and then he keyed the comm. Tell me the frequency, he said. Tell me the exact words. Tell me everything, and tell it slow, because I'm going to write it down on the wall where I can see it, and then I'm going to go tell every quiet little nowhere I've ever flown to that they're not alone. He swallowed. Somebody told me that the bravest thing a person can do is say the words when they don't believe them. I believe them now, so I guess I'll have to find a braver thing to do. He almost laughed. Driving toward the monsters on purpose. That ought to do it. There was a silence on the channel, and then Pelvantor said, in a voice that was no longer tired at all, Welcome to the watch, Otto Brand. You're the first of us in 200 years who gets to fly in the light. She gave him the frequency. She gave him the words, in their oldest and plainest form, the form the watch had carried out of Earth before Earth was a memory. She gave him the names of the nearest watch ships, and the ranges at which they listened, and the way to tell a real signal from a false one. And then, because the witness should see it once and never again, she let him watch the watch go dark. It was not dramatic. That was the thing Otto would never be able to make people understand, no matter how many quiet worlds he told it on. 2,090 warships did not roar away or flash into fold. They simply, one by one, and then all together, stopped being visible. Their drives went cold. Their signatures went flat, the marks on their hulls dimmed, and the dark, which had a moment before held a fleet, held nothing again. The blank place in the chart restored to blankness, except that Otto now knew, would always know, that the blank place was not empty. It had never been empty. It was full of the least lonely fleet that ever flew, dark and cold and patient, listening on a frequency that crossed the whole arm, waiting for the next small voice on the next worst night to say the words. The long vigil was the last to go. It held its position beside the Dover penny for one more moment, and Pel Vantor's voice came one final time, quieter now, already half asleep. "We'll hear you out there," she said. "Every port you reach, every world you wake up to the truth, we feel it, like a light in a far window. You're not carrying our story anymore, Otto. You're carrying us. Keep us moving. Keep us spoken. The day the galaxy stops saying the words is the day the monsters win, and we're counting on a coward with a turtle to make sure that day never comes." A pause, warm, almost a smile in the dark. "Stay in the shell when you have to. Outlive the brave." That was always good advice. Just remember now what the shell is for. It was never for hiding. It was for waiting. And you, Dover Penny, are done waiting. And then the long vigil went dark, and Otto Braun was alone in the empty region of the chart, in a battered freighter that smelled like wet dog, with a turtle on his dash, and a frequency written on a scrap of plastic, and the whole weight of a true thing in his chest. He did not feel alone. He understood now that he never had been. He turned the Dover Penny around and pointed her down the slowest, quietest, dimmest lane he knew, the one that led to a string of small forgotten colonies that no chart bothered to label, and he opened a wide channel, and he began. He told them the truth. He told it plain, the way the watch told everything. No boast, no flag, no name. He told a frightened little mining settlement that the thing they had heard was coming for them in 2 years, was real, and that the watch was real too, and he gave them the frequency and the words, and made them repeat the words back, until a child on the comm got them right. And the child's voice saying the fleet is listening, the fleet is coming, was the most beautiful sound Otto had ever heard. More beautiful than the warm laugh of a commander, more beautiful than the silence of a god going into its own grave. He told them as a story first, because that was how it had to start. He told them it was a myth, an old human myth, too big to be true, and he watched them not believe it, and he was glad, because believing was never the point. He gave them the key, and told them it did not matter whether they thought the door was real, only that they should knock when the night got dark enough. And then he flew on, to the next quiet nowhere, and the next, and the next, and behind him the words spread, world to world, mouth to mouth, child to child, until the frequency that had been silent for decades at a stretch began to carry, here and there, on the worst nights, in the smallest voices, the sound of the cornered remembering that they were not alone. There was a world he reached in the 3rd year that he never forgot. It was a moon, barely a moon, a cold gray rock with 900 people scratching a living out of ice, and they were 3 weeks from being eaten by a thing that came once a generation and had a name in their language that meant the patient hunger. They did not believe Otto. They were too tired and too frightened to believe anything. The patient hunger had eaten their grandparents' settlement and their great-grandparents' settlement, and they had come to understand it the way you understand winter, as a thing that simply is and cannot be argued with, and a fat human in a freighter that smelled like wet dog telling them about a sleeping fleet was, to them, an insult, a cruelty, a false hope offered to people who had run out of room for hope. So Otto did not argue. He simply gave them the frequency and the words, and he made one old woman, the oldest on the moon, repeat them back to him until she had them right, and he told her she did not have to believe. She only had to say them on the night the patient hunger came, even if she was sure no one was listening, even if she was sure it was the last foolish thing she would ever do. And then he left, because the words only worked when the cornered said them, not when a witness said them on their behalf, and he could not stay to see whether it worked, and that was the hardest part of the whole job, leaving, never knowing. He learned 2 years later, from a passing trader, that the patient hunger had come to that cold gray moon, and that an old woman had stood at the edge of her settlement, on the worst night of her life, and said 4 words into a dark she was certain was empty, and that the dark had answered, and that something old and patient and gray had risen off the approaches, and met the patient hunger, and ended it without losing a single soul, and had gone back to sleep before the moon's short day had ended. The 900 people of that cold gray rock were still alive. They had named their first child born after that night, with a word in their language that meant the fleet remembered us, and they taught all their children the 4 words now, and the frequency, and they had built, out of scrap and ice, a small listening post of their own, so that they could pass the words on to the next cold rock down the lane, the way the words had been passed to them. That was the work. That was the whole work, and it was the best work there ever was. The galaxy had laughed at the human myth. The most patient machine that ever crossed the dark had filed it at zero and built a place beneath zero to hold its absurdity, and called it the joke. And the myth had heard the laughing, and the myth had waited, 209 years, dark and cold and certain, and the myth had come the moment a coward whispered it into the quarantine, and the myth had not retreated, and had not failed, and had not lost so much as a single hull, because the myth was true, and a true thing, once a people decide to make it true, and wait however long it takes, is the only weapon in all the dark that nothing can ever eat. Otto Brann flew the slow lanes for the rest of his life. He never carried another paying cargo. He never fixed the water reclaim, and to the end, he drank recycled condensation that tasted like a wet dog, and he said it kept him humble. He taught the words to 411 worlds before he was done, and on at least a dozen of those worlds, in the years that followed, on the worst of nights, a small frightened voice said the words into the dark, and the dark answered, and something old and gray and patient woke up nearby and went, and did not lose, and went back to sleep. Otto never saw the watch again. He did not need to. He knew where it was, which was everywhere small and quiet and worth guarding, which was, in the end, everywhere worth anything at all. He kept the turtle on the dash until the day he died, which was a quiet death, in his sleep, in the slow lane, between two small worlds that both knew the words. The colonists who found the Dover penny drifting did not know who he was, only that the old freighter carried no cargo and one strange relic, a small painted turtle stuck to the console, and beside it, scratched into the plastic of the dash, in a coward's careful hand, a frequency and 4 short words. They did not understand them. But they were a small, quiet people on a small, quiet world at the edge of nowhere, exactly the kind the watch was sworn to guard, and so they did the sensible thing, which was to learn the words anyway, and teach them to their children, and keep the frequency, just in case, the way you keep a candle even when the lights are on. And the watch, dark and cold and patient on the approaches to their world, heard them practicing the words, the way it heard everything, and across 2,090 silent hulls, and 10 times that beyond, one number rose, just a little, the warm small number that the watch had no name for, but felt every time a new world learned that it was not alone. Somewhere out in the blank place in the chart, in the full and least lonely dark, a fleet that the galaxy had once laughed at went on listening, and went on waiting, and was ready, the way it had always been ready, the way it would always be ready, for the next small voice on the next worst night to say the words, and mean nothing by them but please. The galaxy laughed at the human myth. The myth had been listening the whole time, and when the worst thing finally came, without warning, without a sound, without so much as a fold flash to announce it, the fleet arrived, exactly as the myth had always promised, and the laughing stopped, and it never started again.